Do you know the situation when you learn something in school and you think you will never need it again, and then like a couple years later it comes back to haunt you and be like, actually, I'm quite important and you actually need me right now? Yeah, that is kind of what happened in the last couple of weeks, because you know I I don't really remember when it started or why it started, but my brain started to recognize something that it hasn't recognized before, and namely, it was the dynamic in a song or the different dynamics. And like, don't get me wrong, I know about dynamics. I know that in music they are pretty essential to writing it, to experience it. But for some reason, I always thought that in the spectrum of pop music, this is something that is kind of only reserved to arrangements. So this is something that you learn when you want to take a look at uh, arranging something at um, how's the term, how to produce something, and not really for songwriting. And let's put it like that, the last couple of weeks told me or showed me that the answer to that is actually no. Because here's the thing, do you remember that in the last two videos I kind of said that the songs that you wrote felt a little bit more like interludes and not like real like songs? I have the answer to that now. It is actually um, what I would call dynamic development. So what do I mean with that? Imagine a story where nothing really happens, where you have two characters who sit in a cafe and they drink cafe and they have small talk, and there you don't really get to know the characters. There is no story. There is no dynamic. They just have small talk for 2 hours, and that would be kind of boring, right? There wouldn't be a lot going on there. So the same kind of works with music. If you have nothing to show, if you have no shifts in the dynamic of what is like a highlight or something that you can build up to, then it falls kind of flat. And then it feels a little bit like an interlude, like one level of intensity melody that you just have there. And what I kind of realized is that when you write a song, you have to create that tension. You have to create that journey that you can take your listener on, to create interest essentially. So you can surprise them of what you have in store with them and maybe shock them a little bit even, to kind of like, oh yeah, this happens next, by the way. So stereotypically, I would argue the adventure goes as follows. You have the first verse to kind of establish everything and be like, hey, look, it's the first verse. Here's the kind of topic that we want to talk about and the melody that will kind of accompany the entire song. And then you go into the first chorus to have this big, beautiful moment, this bold moment of being like, hi, I am the centerpiece. If you have a hook, it's like you will, if you think of the song, you will listen of B, of the hook. um, and then you have like this big first moment where you can build up to. Then you go to the second verse, I would argue, and that is usually a little bit, due to its arrangement, it feels a little bit more than the first verse, because this also then builds this kind of idea that the song will have a highlight and like this really not loudest, but like the most expressive and biggest point of the entire song. So the second verse usually is like, okay, this is a little bit more than the first verse. We add a little bit more, a couple more instruments, but it's not as heavy as the first chorus. Then the second chorus kind of ramps it up again and is like, okay, I am more than the first chorus, but I am also yet again, the new highlight. I'm the new highest, most dynamic point that you will find here. And then we go into the bridge, which can take a lot of different measures. It can be like a breakdown, or this can already be the highlight of the song, or just hang in between the two choruses. There is really a lot that you can do with the bridge. And then you go to the last chorus, and if it wasn't on the bridge already, then this usually is the highlight, and then you kind of just pack it up, end it, and then the song is done. And this is what I would consider to be the kind of standard for dynamics in pop songs. Of course, we can also add different elements, an outro, pre-chorus, post-chorus, to rather build up tension or break it down, or a vibe just in there to have this kind of relief. There's a lot of other elements that we can add, but I think a multitude of songs just works with what I just told you, or kind of changes that up a little bit. Yeah. So, in an attempt to further categorize that knowledge and trying to make it universal, I would argue that as long as something changes in the song, in the different parts of the song, people will recognize it as such. So you don't really have to build up towards the chorus, and then the chorus is the big moment. You can also just maybe start with the chorus, and then you start with this big explosive moment, and then you go down a little bit for the verse, or maybe the chorus is the quieter part. Maybe the chorus isn't that much. Maybe it's just two lines of like you put a focus on the story, on the verse, and then the chorus is just something to repeat over and over again, and it's not that important. You can do a lot of them. I would argue as long as something changes, people will recognize that something will or something has changed, and that you enter a different part of the song. I also want to note very quickly that this change of dynamic doesn't has to be in between different parts of the song. It can also be within one part of the song. I think the perfect example that we have one of this is Olivia Rodrigo's Vampire, where it's not the chorus begins and you have this big explosion of dynamics, and oh my god, the chorus is here. But you have a song that kind of builds and builds and builds and builds until the end of the chorus, where she then sings Bloodsucker Famefucker, to then break down again. But here you also have dynamic shifts within the chorus itself. It still gradually climbs and climbs and climbs and climbs and climbs towards that one point. But I would argue that maybe this is something for a different video. So, why is this important? I would argue that here's the thing. One thing that I struggled with in the past a lot is that I was a little bit too focused on melodies. And I thought, okay, the melody, you write a melody, you repeat it. Then this is the verse. Then you write a chorus, and then you have to repeat it, and also in order for people to understand that it's the chorus. Essentially, the idea behind it was that a melody is tied to the part of the song. So there is a melody for the verse, and there is a melody for the chorus. And approaching this towards the lens of, um, I forgot the word. Give me a second. Dynamics. Approaching this to this through this lens, you get a lot more freedom in writing melodies, and you can make much more with it, because I think once you kind of declare this is the chorus, and this is the verse, and you declare it through a change in dynamics, then people will understand this without you feeling the need to, without you having to actually repeat the melodies over and over again. And I think the best example for how I got here and why I to this thesis, and also to explain this, is Florence and the Machine's Sympathy Magic. The song follows a very common verse, chorus, bridge, outro pattern. However, what makes the song stand out, to me at least, or makes it important for this argument, is that the first verse and the second verse have very little to do with each other. They have different chord progressions, different lyrics, different melodies. The only thing that kind of defines them as verse 1 and verse 2 is that they are less intense than the chorus is, and the second verse is also kind of clipped in between two choruses, which is usually where you find the second verse. But beside that, they don't really have a lot in common. I think what you can see here pretty beautifully is that if you work through dynamics, you can change up almost every other aspect of the song, and people will still recognize it as maybe verse 2 in this instance, although they don't really have a lot in common with each other, which gives you a lot of freedom about writing, about if you have a set of lyrics and you know they don't fit the same rhythmic pattern as maybe the set of lyrics that you had for the first verse, you can now actually still put both of them side by side, if you manage to declare them as verses to the dynamic portion of your song. Another song I briefly want to talk about is Taylor Swift's Fortnite, because the song itself follows the same construction as Florence and the Machine's Sympathy Magic. But what this song does different, what I think is rather interesting here, is something you can see in the break between the first verse and the first chorus. Because Florence and the Machine's Sympathy Magic is heavily arranged. There are a lot of drums and synths and vocal production there to also bolster the idea of this is the chorus, this is the first verse. The arrangement is very plays a very crucial part towards not recognizing them as such, but making that very clear and very obvious. And Fortnite kind of takes a different approach in that regard because, especially in that specific part from like first verse to first chorus, you have a synth and drums that are established, and then before the first chorus, you have other synth melodies to kind of announce that something is coming. Beware, we will enter a new stage right now. But then when you go into the chorus, it actually just breaks down to the exact same synth and drums that you also had in the verse. But undoubtedly, something has shifted in the dynamics of it. At the beginning of the chorus, we kind of have this very small melodic run, with the lyrics and fora before then the chord progression starts again. And I would argue, and like the entire chorus unfolds, and I would argue that this specific part and the fact that the melody in the chorus adds more staccato rhythm to it and has more syllables to it, this also kind of to some degree adds dynamic growth to the song itself. So what I'm trying to get at is that melody can add something to it. It doesn't have to, though. And in this particular instance, we also have to note that the change in the dynamics is not as obvious or as big as it is, for example, in each parts of Sympathy Magic. It's much more quieter, but it definitely is there. So I would argue that with melody, you can definitely change this up, but you have freedom to decide if you want to do that or if you want to change or if you want to do that with something else. I think at the end of the day, what this kind of topic taught me is that I can now approach music much more freely than I could before. Because now, focusing on dynamics, I learned that I have much more freedom in terms of melodic writing, in terms of lyricism that I can go with, and still have people understand what I was going for. And that honestly, that is just such a huge relief because it gives you so much more freedom to do what you want to do. And I think that is a very cool thing, especially when you want to be artistic and you can kind of, okay, you don't have to be confined that much, um, and still kind of confined to the norm. And that's kind of it for this week's video. So I hope you liked it. I don't know. It got a little bit more technical again. We'll see how what the next video will bring. But sometimes you have to go there. And I think this was, for me at least, a very I learned a lot with this topic, so I'm very happy that I could cover it. So with that, have a nice week. Bye.